The morning sun shone through the large windows of the television studio in New York City. Workers moved around quickly, setting up cameras and checking lights. Today was going to be a special day on The View, one of America's most popular morning talk shows. Whoopi Goldberg sat in her usual chair at the round table. She had been hosting this show for many years. People knew her for her quick jokes and strong opinions. She was not afraid to say what she thought about anything. This morning, she felt good and ready to talk about the day's topics. The other hosts were also getting ready. They talked quietly among themselves about the show's schedule. There would be the usual news discussions, celebrity interviews, and audience questions. But today had something different planned that none of them had done before. The show's producer, Sarah, walked over to the host's table. She carried a clipboard and looked excited about something. Sarah had been working on this special segment for weeks. She wanted to do something that would teach the audience about different cultures and traditions. "Remember, we have our special guest coming in the second segment," Sarah told the hosts. "He's a real British Royal Guard from Buckingham Palace in London. This is a big deal. We've never had someone like this on the show before." Whoopi looked up from her notes. She had heard about this guest but had not thought much about it. "Oh, right, the guy with the funny hat," she said with a smile. "This should be interesting. I bet he has some good stories about standing still all day." The other hosts smiled politely, but they could tell Whoopi was already planning to make jokes. This was her way. She liked to keep things light and funny, even when talking about serious topics. Sometimes this worked well, but other times it got her into trouble. Sarah looked a little worried. "Just remember, he's here to talk about the history and traditions of the Royal Guard. It's educational content. Our viewers want to learn about British culture." "Don't worry," Whoopi said, waving her hand. "I'll be good. But if he's too serious, I might have to help him loosen up a little." In another part of the building, Sergeant James Mitchell was getting ready for his television appearance. He stood in a small dressing room, checking his uniform one last time. Every button was polished. Every piece of fabric was perfectly straight. His black boots shone like mirrors. James had been a Royal Guard for 15 years. Before that, he had served in the British Army for 10 years. He had seen and done things that most people could never imagine, but today he was nervous in a different way. He had never been on American television before. The uniform he wore was not just clothing to him. It was a symbol of everything he believed in. The red tunic, the black pants, the white belt, each piece had meaning. But most important were the medals on his chest. Each one told a story of service, sacrifice, and honor. A young assistant knocked on his door. "Sergeant Mitchell, it's time to go to the studio. Are you ready?" James took a deep breath and nodded. "Ready," he said in his calm, clear voice. As they walked through the hallways of the television building, people stopped to look at him. Some took pictures with their phones. Children pointed and smiled. James was used to this attention. At Buckingham Palace, tourists did the same thing every day. But this felt different. He was about to talk to millions of Americans about his job and his country's traditions. He wanted to do it right. He wanted people to understand that being a Royal Guard was about more than just standing still and looking nice for pictures. Back in the studio, the show had started. Whoopi and the other hosts talked about the morning news. The audience laughed at their jokes and clapped when they agreed with something. The cameras moved smoothly around the set, capturing every moment. During the commercial break, Sarah came over to the hosts again. "Our Royal Guard will be here in 5 minutes. Remember, his name is Sergeant James Mitchell. He's been very generous with his time to come here and talk to us. Whoopi nodded, but she was looking at her phone. She had just seen a funny video online and was not really paying attention. She was thinking about how she could use some of the jokes from the video in the interview. The audience started to buzz with excitement. Someone had told them about the special guest, and they were looking forward to seeing a real royal guard up close. Many of them had only seen royal guards in movies or on postcards from London. The floor manager counted down with his fingers. "We're back in 5, 4, 3. He pointed at the hosts, and they smiled at the cameras. "Welcome back to The View," Whoopi said to the camera. "Now we have something really special for you. We're going to meet a real British Royal Guard. You know, one of those guys who stands outside Buckingham Palace and doesn't move no matter what happens." The audience laughed a little. They were expecting this to be fun and educational. "Let's bring him out," Whoopi continued. "Please welcome Sergeant James Mitchell from Her Majesty's Royal Guard." The studio doors opened, and James walked in, and moved with perfect posture, his shoulders back and his head high. His red uniform was bright under the studio lights. The tall black hat on his head made him look even taller than he already was. The audience clapped politely. Some people gasped when they saw how official and impressive he looked. This was not like having a movie star or a politician on the show. This was someone who represented a real tradition that was hundreds of years old. James walked to the interview area and stood at attention. He did not sit down. This was protocol. Royal Guards stand when they are on duty, and in his mind, he was always on duty when wearing the uniform. Whoopi looked him up and down. Her eyes stopped at his chest, where several medals and ribbons were displayed in perfect rows. They caught the studio lights and sparkled slightly. "Well, look at you," Whoopi said with a big smile. "Don't you look fancy? That's quite a collection of bling you've got there." The audience laughed, but some people looked uncomfortable. James remained perfectly still, but his eyes focused more sharply on Whoopi. Sarah, watching from behind the cameras, felt her stomach drop. She could already tell this was not going to go the way she had planned. James cleared his throat politely. "Good morning, Ms. Goldberg. Thank you for having me on your program." His voice was calm and professional, with a clear British accent that made him sound very official. He was trying to keep the conversation focused on why he was there. But Whoopi was already planning her next joke. She looked at his uniform again and smiled. The studio audience waited to see what would happen next. Whoopi leaned back in her chair and gestured toward James with a playful smile. She was in her element now, ready to entertain the audience with what she thought would be harmless fun. "So, Sergeant Mitchell," she began, emphasizing his title, in a way that sounded almost teasing, "I have to ask about all those shiny things on your chest. Did you get those at the same place where kids get stickers for good behavior?" The audience laughed nervously. Some people thought it was funny, but others could sense that something was not quite right about the joke. James remained standing perfectly straight. His face did not change expression, but his jaw tightened just slightly. "These are military decorations, Ms. Goldberg. They represent years of service to my country." "Oh, service!" Whoopi said, clapping her hands together. "Well, standing outside a palace all day must be very hard work. Do you get a medal for not falling asleep on the job?" More laughter came from the audience, but it was getting more uncomfortable. The other hosts at the table were starting to look worried. Joy Behar glanced at Sunny Hostin, and both women had concerned expressions on their faces. Whoopi was not paying attention to their signals. She was focused on getting laughs and keeping the show entertaining. In her mind, she was just having fun with a guest who seemed too serious. I mean, look at all of that, she continued, pointing directly at James's chest. It looks like you raided a costume jewelry store. Are those real medals? Or are they just props to make tourists think you're important? The studio became quieter. Camera operators looked at each other with raised eyebrows. The floor manager shifted uncomfortably behind his equipment. James took a slow, deep breath. His training had taught him to stay calm in all situations, but this was different from anything he had experienced before. He was being mocked on live television in front of millions of people. These decorations are earned through military service, he said carefully. Each one has a specific meaning and represents actions taken in the line of duty. Actions? Whoopi laughed. What kind of actions? Standing really still? Not blinking for a really long time? Come on, we're not talking about real soldiers here. You're basically a fancy security guard for rich people. The audience was no longer laughing. Many people looked shocked by what they were hearing. Some whispered to each other, asking if this was supposed to be funny. Sarah, the producer, was frantically trying to get Whoopi's attention from behind the cameras. She made hand signals telling her to change the subject, but Whoopi was not looking her way. Joy Behar tried to step in. Whoopi, maybe we should ask Sergeant Mitchell about the history of the Royal Guard. That's why he's here, right? But Whoopi was not ready to move on. She was enjoying herself too much. No, I want to know more about the fancy dress-up clothes. I mean, seriously, how long does it take you to put on all that costume every morning? Do you have help getting dressed? Like a little kid? James's hands, which had been relaxed at his sides, slowly formed into fists. He was fighting every instinct that told him to defend himself and his honor, but his training and professionalism kept him standing at attention. The uniform is part of a tradition that goes back hundreds of years, he said, his voice still, controlled but with an edge that had not been there before. It represents the crown and the people of the United Kingdom. The crown, Whoopi exclaimed, throwing her hands up dramatically. Oh, excuse me, Your Majesty. I didn't realize we had royalty on the show today. Should I bow? Should we all bow? She looked around at the audience and made an exaggerated bowing motion. Some people in the audience looked away, embarrassed by what they were seeing. Sonny Hostin tried to change the subject. Sergeant Mitchell, can you tell us about your training? What does someone have to do to become a Royal Guard? Whoopi interrupted before James could answer. Training? What kind of training do you need to stand around and look pretty? Do they teach you how to ignore people? How to pretend you're a statue? I bet my grandson could do that job. The camera showed James's face in close-up. His expression remained professional, but his eyes showed something deeper. There was pain there, and anger and disappointment. This was not what he had expected when he agreed to come on the show. Ms. Goldberg, he said quietly, I think there may be some misunderstanding about what the Royal Guard does and represents. Oh, there's no misunderstanding, Whoopi replied quickly. I see exactly what this is. It's all about looking fancy and impressing tourists. All those medals and ribbons and shiny buttons. It's just dress up for grown men who want to feel important. The other hosts were now openly uncomfortable. Meghan McCain cleared her throat loudly, trying to get Whoopi's attention. But Whoopi was in full performance mode now. I mean, come on, she continued. In America, our soldiers go to real wars and fight real battles. They don't spend their time playing dress-up and posing for pictures with tourists. What's the most dangerous thing you've ever faced? A pigeon landing on your hat? The audience was almost completely silent now. Even the people who had been laughing earlier were beginning to understand that this had gone too far. James remained perfectly still, but something in his posture had changed. He seemed to be preparing himself for something. His breathing was deeper, more controlled. Behind the cameras, Sarah was making frantic hand signals to the director. She wanted them to cut to commercial, but the director was not sure what to do. This was live television, and they could not just stop the show. Whoopi reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "I should take a picture of you," she said. "My friends won't believe I met a real-life toy soldier. Do you do different poses, or do you just have the one?" She held up her phone and pretended to take a picture, making exaggerated camera sounds. "Say cheese. Oh, wait, you probably can't smile. Is smiling against the rules?" James looked directly at her for the first time since the interview began. His eyes were steady and serious. "Ms. Goldberg," he said in a voice that was still calm but carried a new weight to it. "May I ask you something?" "Sure, toy soldier. Ask away. Do you know what these medals represent? Do you know how they are earned?" Whoopi waved her hand dismissively. "I'm sure they're very impressive to people who care about that kind of thing. But let's be real. They're just pretty decorations, right? Like badges at summer camp?" The studio was now completely quiet, except for the hum of the cameras and lights. Even the crew members had stopped working to watch what was happening. James nodded slowly. "I see," he said. "Would you like me to tell you what they actually represent?" "If you want to," Whoopi said with a shrug. "But make it quick. Our audience probably wants to hear about something more interesting." What she did not know was that she had just given James the opening he needed. What she did not realize was that her casual dismissal of his medals was about to lead to a moment that would change everything in that studio. James straightened his shoulders and looked directly into the main camera. When he spoke next, his voice would carry the weight of experiences that Whoopi could never imagine. James looked directly at Whoopi and nodded politely. "Thank you," he said. "I would like to explain what these medals mean if you don't mind." Whoopi leaned back in her chair with a smirk. "Go ahead," she said, still thinking this would be boring. Military talk that she could make jokes about. "Entertain us with your war stories." The audience settled in, expecting to hear about ceremonies and parades. Most of them thought royal guards only did ceremonial duties. They had no idea what James was about to tell them. James reached up and touched the first medal on the left side of his chest. It was bronze-colored with a blue and white ribbon. His fingers were gentle with it, like he was touching something. "Sacred, this is the Afghanistan Operational Service Medal," he said quietly. "I received this after serving 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan between 2008 and 2012. The studio became a little quieter. Some people in the audience shifted in their seats. This was not what they had expected to hear. Whoopi's smile flickered for just a moment, but she recovered quickly. "Oh, so you did some real military work before you became a fancy guard. That's nice." James did not react to her comment. He continued speaking in the same calm, steady voice. "During my first tour in Afghanistan, I was part of a convoy that was attacked by an improvised explosive device. That's what we call an IED. It's a bomb hidden by the side of the road." The audience was now completely quiet. Even Whoopi had stopped smiling. "My best friend, Private Tommy Harrison, was in the vehicle next to mine," James continued. "He was 22 years old. He had just gotten engaged to his girlfriend back home. The IED exploded directly under his vehicle." James paused for a moment, looking down at the medal. When he looked up again, his eyes were focused on something far away. Tommy died instantly. So did Corporal Davies and Private Williams. I was one of the soldiers who had to carry their bodies back to base. This medal reminds me of them every day. The studio was so quiet that you could hear the air conditioning running. Whoopi's mouth was slightly open, but no words came out. James moved his hand to the next medal. This one was silver with red, white, and blue stripes on the ribbon. "This is the Iraq medal," he said. "I earned this during 2 tours in Iraq between 2005 and 2007. During my second tour, our unit was stationed near a marketplace in Baghdad. Insurgents attacked during the busy morning hours when families were shopping for food." He paused again, his jaw tightening slightly as he remembered. There were civilians everywhere. Women, children, elderly people. They were running and screaming. Some were injured by shrapnel from the explosions. Others were trapped under debris from damaged buildings. Joy Behar was now leaning forward, listening intently. The other hosts had completely forgotten about their notes and talking points. "We were supposed to engage the enemy," James continued, "but there were innocent people in the line of fire. I made the decision to leave cover and help evacuate civilians instead of pursuing the attackers." His voice remained steady, but there was emotion underneath it now. "I carried a little girl who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. She had blood on her face and was crying for her mother. I ran through gunfire 3 times to get people to safety. When it was over, we had saved 17 civilians. But we lost 2 more of our brothers that day." Whoopi was staring at him now. Her hands, which had been gesturing and moving constantly throughout the show, were now still in her lap. James touched the third medal. This one was smaller, but it seemed to catch the light more than the others. "This is the Humanitarian Service Medal," he said. "I received this for disaster relief work in Pakistan after the 2010 floods. Over 20 million people were affected by those floods. Entire villages were underwater." The camera zoomed in on his face. His expression was calm, but his eyes showed the weight of what he was remembering. "We worked 18-hour days for 3 months," he said. "We pulled people from collapsed buildings, delivered food and medical supplies to areas that could only be reached by helicopter, and helped set up refugee camps for families who had lost everything." He looked directly at Whoopi as he spoke. "I remember one family, a mother with 4 children. Their house had been completely destroyed. They had been living on a rooftop for 6 days with no food or clean water. The youngest child, a baby, was very sick with fever." James's voice got quieter, and everyone in the studio had to lean forward to hear him. "We got them to medical help just in time. The baby survived. The mother kissed my hands and cried. She said I was an angel sent by God. But I was just doing my job. That's what soldiers do. We help people who need help." Sunny Hostin had tears in her eyes. Several people in the audience were also crying. James moved to the 4th medal. This one was different from the others. It was larger and had a distinctive purple ribbon. "This is the Purple Heart," he said. "I received this after being wounded during a patrol in Afghanistan. We were searching for a kidnapped aid worker. Intelligence told us she was being held in a village about 50 miles from our base." The studio was completely silent except for the sound of James's voice. "We found the building where she was being held. But it was a trap. The insurgents were waiting for us. They had set up a crossfire that covered all the exits. When we tried to extract the aid worker, they opened fire from 3 directions. James touched his left shoulder unconsciously. I took shrapnel from a grenade in my shoulder and back. But the aid worker was still alive. She was injured too, but she was conscious. Someone had to carry her to the evacuation point." He looked around the studio, making eye contact with different people in the audience. "I couldn't leave her there. None of us could, so I carried her on my back for 2 miles through enemy territory while the rest of my unit provided cover. We all made it out alive." James touched the last medal he had mentioned. This one seemed to be the most important to him. "This is the military cross," he said. "It is awarded for exemplary gallantry during active operations against the enemy." Whoopi was now leaning forward in her chair. She looked like she wanted to say something, but she couldn't find any words. "I received this after an incident in Helmand Province, Afghanistan," James continued. "My unit was escorting a convoy of supply trucks to a forward operating base. We were attacked by a large group of insurgents who had prepared an ambush." His voice was getting stronger now, more commanding. "3 of our vehicles were disabled by rocket fire. Several of my brothers were wounded and trapped in the vehicles. The enemy was advancing on our position. Someone had to go back for the wounded soldiers." James stood even straighter if that was possible. "I made 3 trips back into the kill zone under heavy fire. Each time, I carried out a wounded soldier. The 3rd soldier, Lance Corporal Peters, had severe injuries to both legs. He couldn't walk at all." The audience was completely captivated. Some people were crying openly now. "I carried Lance Corporal Peters on my back while enemy bullets were hitting the ground around us. I could hear them whistling past my ears, but I couldn't leave him there. You never leave a brother behind. That's not what soldiers do." James looked directly into the main camera, as if he was speaking to everyone watching at home. All 3 of those soldiers survived. They went home to their families. 2 of them were able to walk again after surgery and rehabilitation. Lance, Corporal Peters, is in a wheelchair now, but he's alive. He got married last year. His wife sent me a picture of their wedding. The studio was absolutely silent. Even the camera operators had stopped moving. James looked back at Whoopi. Her face had completely changed. The joking, playful expression was gone. She looked shocked and ashamed. "So you see, Ms. Goldberg," James said quietly, "these medals are not costume jewelry. They are not props for tourists. Each one represents real people, real sacrifices, and real service. They represent brothers who didn't come home, and the responsibility I carry to honor their memory." Whoopi opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. For the first time in her long career on television, she was completely speechless. James reached up and touched the most prominent medallion on his chest. It was larger than the others and hung from a distinctive ribbon with red, white, and blue stripes. His fingers lingered on it for a moment, and when he looked up, his eyes held a depth that commanded absolute attention from everyone in the studio. "This," he said, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to fill the entire room, "is the military cross. It is one of the highest honors that can be awarded to a British soldier for exceptional bravery in the face of the enemy." The studio was so quiet that even the camera operators had stopped adjusting their equipment. Everyone was focused entirely on James and what he was about to say. "I received this medal for actions taken during Operation Herrick in Afghanistan," he continued. "It was September 15th, 2011, a date I will never forget for the rest of my life." Whoopi sat frozen in her chair. Her usual confident demeanor had completely disappeared. She looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. James's voice remained steady, but there was an emotional undercurrent that everyone could feel. "My unit was part of a patrol in the Sangin Valley. We were conducting a routine sweep to clear a village of improvised explosive devices before aid workers could enter to help the local population. Intelligence had told us the area was mostly clear, but intelligence is not always right." He paused, looking down at the medal again. "We were ambushed by approximately 40 insurgents who had been waiting for us. They had positioned themselves in buildings around the village square and opened fire with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. Within the first 30 seconds of the attack, 3 of our vehicles were disabled and multiple soldiers were wounded. The audience was completely captivated. Some people had tears in their eyes already, sensing that something terrible was coming. The wounded soldiers were trapped in the vehicles, which were taking heavy fire, James continued. The vehicles were starting to burn from the rocket damage. If someone didn't get those men out quickly, they would die. His jaw tightened as he remembered the scene. My commanding officer ordered us to fall back to a defensive position and wait for air support. But air support was 20 minutes away. The wounded soldiers didn't have 20 minutes. James looked directly at Whoopi as he spoke the next words. I made the decision to disobey that order. I told my commander that I was going to get our brothers out, and I asked him not to stop me. The studio was absolutely silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to have stopped running. I ran across approximately 100 meters of open ground while insurgents were firing at me from multiple directions. Bullets were hitting the ground all around me. I could hear them whistling past my head, but I couldn't think about that. I could only think about the soldiers who were trapped. James's voice got stronger, more commanding. The first soldier I reached was Private Collins. He was 20 years old. A piece of shrapnel had cut deep into his leg, and he was losing a lot of blood. The vehicle was filling with smoke from electrical fires. I pulled him out and carried him to safety. He took a breath before continuing. Then I went back for Corporal Thompson. He had taken shrapnel to his chest and arm. He was conscious, but barely. The enemy fire was getting heavier. They had figured out what I was doing and were concentrating their fire on the disabled vehicles. Several people in the audience were now crying openly. The camera showed faces of people who were completely absorbed in James's story. I carried Corporal Thompson to safety and then went back for the third soldier. Lance Corporal Peters was in the worst condition. Both of his legs had been severely injured by shrapnel from a rocket-propelled grenade. He couldn't move at all. James's voice began to shake slightly, but he continued. By the time I reached Peters, the vehicle was completely engulfed in flames. I had to break the windows to get to him. The heat was so intense it was hard to breathe. I could smell burning fuel, and knew the vehicle could explode at any moment. The other hosts at the table were now leaning forward, completely focused on every word. I pulled Peters from the vehicle and put him on my back. He was unconscious by then, which was probably a blessing. I ran back across that open ground with a full-grown man on my back while enemy fighters were shooting at us from 3 different directions. James looked around the studio, making eye contact with different people. I made it to safety with Peters, but I wasn't finished. There was one more soldier still trapped. Private Martinez was in the furthest vehicle, which had rolled over when it was hit by a rocket. I could see him moving inside, but he was trapped under twisted metal. His voice got quieter, and everyone in the studio leaned forward to hear him. This time I didn't run alone. 3 other soldiers from my unit decided to come with me. We ran to that overturned vehicle together while the enemy continued firing. It took all 4 of us to lift the metal off Martinez and pull him free. James paused for a long moment, looking down at his hands. All 4 soldiers survived, he said finally. Collins and Thompson made full recoveries and returned to duty. Martinez had some permanent injuries to his back, but he was able to walk and eventually returned home to his family. He looked up again, and his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. Peters. Lance Corporal Peters lost both of his legs below the knee. But he's alive. He has a wife now, and a baby daughter. He sends me pictures sometimes. He's learned to use prosthetic legs and even runs marathons to raise money for wounded veterans. The studio was completely silent except for the sound of people quietly crying. James touched the medal again. The official citation for this medal says I showed extraordinary courage and selfless devotion to duty in the face of extreme danger. But I don't think about it that way. I think about 4 families who still have their sons, husbands, and fathers. I think about Peter's dancing at his wedding even though he had to learn how to do it with artificial legs. He looked directly at Whoopi, who now had tears streaming down her face. I also think about the soldiers who didn't make it home from that deployment. Private Jackson, who was killed 2 weeks before that ambush. Sergeant Williams, who died when his vehicle hit an IED. Corporal Davies, who was shot by a sniper while on patrol. James's voice became even more intense. I wear this medal for them too, because they showed the same courage, the same devotion to duty. They made the same sacrifices. The only difference is that they didn't survive to receive recognition for it. He stood even straighter, his military bearing now completely evident to everyone in the studio. When I put on this uniform every day, when I stand guard at Buckingham Palace, when I participate in ceremonies, I carry the memory of every soldier I served with. The living and the dead, the wounded and the whole. They are all with me. James looked into the main camera, speaking directly to the millions of people watching at home. So when someone calls these medals costume jewelry or props for tourists, they are not just insulting me. They are insulting every soldier who earned them through blood, sweat, sacrifice, and loss. They are insulting families who have empty chairs at their dinner tables. They are insulting children who will grow up without fathers and wives who will sleep alone for the rest of their lives. The silence in the studio was profound. It was not the awkward silence of a show that had gone wrong. It was the reverent silence of people who had been confronted with a truth they had never considered before. Whoopi sat motionless, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. She opened her mouth several times as if trying to speak, but no words came out. For the first time in her long career, she was truly speechless. James stood perfectly straight, his military bearing more evident than ever. The weight of his words hung in the air like a heavy blanket over the entire studio. He looked around at the faces watching him, the hosts, the audience, the crew members, who had stopped their work to listen. Every person in that room had been changed by what they had just heard. These medals, James said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the absolute silence, are not decorations. They are not costume jewelry. They are not props for tourists to take pictures with. He touched each medal on his chest one more time, his fingers gentle and reverent. They are reminders. Reminders of brothers and sisters who will never come home. Reminders of families who have paid the ultimate price for freedom. Reminders of the responsibility I carry every day to honor their sacrifice and their memory. James looked directly at Whoopi, who sat frozen in her chair with tears streaming down her face. Her usual confidence and quick wit had completely abandoned her. Every morning when I put on this uniform, James continued, I think about Private Tommy Harrison, who was 22 years old when he died in Afghanistan. I think about his fiancée, Sarah, who still visits his grave every week, 5 years later. His voice grew stronger, filled with passion and pain. I think about Sergeant Williams, who had 3 children and coached Little League baseball in his hometown. His youngest daughter was only 4 when he died. She's 9 now, and she still asks her mother when Daddy is coming home. The audience was completely silent except for the quiet sounds of people crying. Even the tough camera operators had tears in their eyes. I think about Corporal Davies, who was saving money to buy his parents a house because they had struggled financially their whole lives. He died 2 weeks before he was supposed to come home on leave. James's jaw tightened, and his eyes blazed with emotion. These men died serving their country. They died protecting people they had never met, in places far from home, because they believed in something bigger than themselves. And when I stand guard at Buckingham Palace, when I participate in ceremonies, when I wear these medals, I am not just representing the crown or the British military. He straightened his shoulders and looked into the main camera. I am representing every soldier who has ever worn a uniform. Every person who has ever been willing to sacrifice their life for others. Every family that has lost someone they loved in service to their country. The silence in the studio was profound and complete. It was not the uncomfortable quiet of a show that had gone wrong. It was the respectful silence of people who had been confronted with a truth that was bigger than anything they had expected to encounter that morning. James looked back at Whoopi, his expression stern but not unkind. So when someone mocks these medals, when someone calls them shiny props or fancy decorations, they are not just insulting me. They are insulting every fallen soldier, every grieving family, every child who will grow up without a parent. Whoopi tried to speak. She opened her mouth and took a breath, but no words came out. She looked around desperately as if searching for the right thing to say, but she found nothing. The woman who had built her career on always having something to say was completely speechless. James took a step closer to the interview area, his presence commanding and dignified. I did not come here today to be insulted or mocked, he said calmly. I came here to help people understand the history and traditions of the Royal Guard. I came here to build bridges between our countries and cultures. He paused, letting his words sink in. But I will not stand here and allow the sacrifice of good soldiers to be treated as a joke. I will not allow their memory to be dishonored by people who have never served, never sacrificed, never lost a friend in battle. The other hosts at the table were now looking at Whoopi with expressions of shock and disappointment. Joy Behar had her hand over her mouth. Sunny Hostin was shaking her head slowly. They all understood that something terrible had happened, and they didn't know how to fix it. James maintained his military posture, but his voice became gentler. I understand that many people do not know what military service really means. I understand that the Royal Guard can seem like a ceremonial position to those who don't know our history. But ignorance is not an excuse for disrespect. He looked around the studio one more time. Every person who wears a military uniform, whether they are American, British, Canadian, Australian, or from any other country, deserves respect, not because of their nationality, not because of their politics, but because they were willing to put their lives on the line for others. James touched his chest where the medals hung. These medals represent more than just my service. They represent the service of every soldier who has ever worn them. They represent a promise that we make to never forget those who have fallen and to never let their sacrifice be in vain. The studio remained absolutely silent. Even the sounds from the hallway outside seemed to have stopped, as if the entire building was holding its breath. Whoopi finally found her voice, but it was barely a whisper. I'm sorry, she managed to say, her voice cracking with emotion. I didn't know. James nodded slowly. Now you do, he said simply. The camera held on James's face for a long moment. His expression was calm and dignified, but his eyes showed the pain of someone who had been forced to relive traumatic memories to defend the honor of his fallen comrades. Behind the cameras, Sarah the producer was frantically signaling to the director. They needed to cut to commercial, but nobody wanted to break the spell of this moment. Finally, the director made the decision. The camera slowly pulled back to show the entire studio, James standing at attention in his perfect uniform, Whoopi sitting motionless with tears on her face, the other hosts looking stunned and ashamed, and the audience sitting in complete silence. "We'll be right back after this commercial break," Joy Behar said quietly into her microphone, her voice barely audible. As the cameras stopped rolling and the commercial began to play, something extraordinary happened. One person in the audience started to clap, then another, then another. Within seconds, the entire studio was erupting in applause. But this was not the polite applause that usually followed a television interview. This was not the enthusiastic clapping that came after a funny joke or entertaining story. This was something deeper and more meaningful. This was the sound of respect. This was the sound of people who had learned something important about honor, sacrifice, and service. This was the sound of Americans showing their appreciation for a British soldier who had just taught them about the true meaning of courage. James remained at attention throughout the applause, but a small smile appeared on his face for the first time since he had entered the studio. He nodded slightly to acknowledge the audience's response. Whoopi sat in her chair, still crying, still unable to speak. She had built her career on being quick with words, on being able to handle any situation, with humor or sharp commentary. But today, she had learned that some things are bigger than entertainment. Some things demand respect rather than laughter. The applause continued for nearly 2 full minutes. When it finally died down, the studio remained quiet. People were wiping their eyes and looking at each other with expressions of wonder and shame, and newfound understanding. James had done more than just defend his medals. He had opened the eyes of millions of people to the true cost of freedom. He had reminded everyone watching that behind every uniform, behind every medal, behind every ceremony, there are real people who have given real things up for others, and he had done it all with dignity, grace, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing you have served something greater than yourself. The commercial break ended, but the view never quite returned to normal that day. The rest of the show was subdued and respectful. Whoopi barely spoke for the remainder of the program. When she did, her voice was quiet and humble. That evening, clips of James's speech would be shared millions of times on social media. Veterans from around the world would thank him for defending their honor. Families of fallen soldiers would reach out to express their gratitude. But in that moment, in that studio, all that mattered was the silence. The profound, respectful silence of people who had been reminded of what real heroism looks like.